has confirmed it's launched an attack on Iran.
Dawn had barely broken over the dark waters of the Arabian Sea when the radar operators aboard the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln noticed something unusual. At first, it looked like a routine contact, just another blip on the massive radar screens that constantly sweep hundreds of miles of sky. But within seconds, that small cluster of signals triggered a wave of tension across the carrier's combat information center. 4 fast-moving aircraft had suddenly changed course. They were coming directly toward the carrier strike group. At first, no one spoke. The radar technicians quietly confirmed the track, the speed, the altitude. Then the identification systems ran their analysis, comparing the radar signature against known aircraft profiles. When the result appeared on the screen, the room grew colder. MiG-29 fighters. And not just one. 4 Iranian MiG-29s had abruptly redirected their flight path and were now flying straight toward one of the most powerful warships on Earth. On the flight deck above, more than 70 aircraft sat ready. Fighters, electronic warfare jets, helicopters, all part of the floating airbase that gives the USS Abraham Lincoln its reputation as a moving fortress. But even a fortress has procedures when unknown fighters appear on an intercept course. Within moments, alarms sounded across key stations on the carrier. Officers leaned over consoles. Radios crackled with clipped voices. Somewhere below deck, a command was quietly issued. Stand by to launch interceptors. Out on the endless blue horizon, the MiG-29s continued their approach, flying in a loose but unmistakably coordinated formation. Their speed suggested confidence. Their course suggested intention. No radio call came from the approaching aircraft. No identification signal. Nothing. Just 4 fast-moving fighters slicing through the morning sky toward an American carrier strike group. Inside the command center, the tension built with every passing second. Radar plots updated. Distance markers shrank. The strike group's escort ships, guided missile destroyers and cruisers, shifted their sensor focus, locking multiple systems onto the incoming tracks. This was no longer a routine encounter. It was becoming a situation. Above deck, the calm rhythm of carrier life suddenly accelerated. Deck crews moved with practiced urgency. Engines roared to life. 2 American fighters prepared for launch, their pilots already receiving rapid updates about the unidentified aircraft closing in from the horizon. Still, the MiG-29s came, closer and closer. At a certain distance, encounters like this enter a dangerous zone, where every maneuver, every radio call, every second of hesitation can change the outcome. A misunderstanding at high speed between heavily armed aircraft can escalate faster than anyone expects. On the radar screens, the 4 MiGs crossed another invisible line in the sky. The decision window was shrinking. And somewhere out there, 4 Iranian fighters were about to discover exactly how a U.S. carrier strike group responds when unknown aircraft fly too close. What happened next would leave everyone watching the radar screens holding their breath. In the early hours of a quiet morning over the Arabian Sea, the vast radar systems aboard the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln were performing the same task they carry out every second of every day: watching the sky. Hundreds of miles around the carrier strike group, sophisticated sensors scanned the airspace, tracking commercial aircraft, monitoring regional military activity, and filtering through countless signals that appear on the radar screens. Most contacts were routine. Civilian flights passing through international air corridors. Occasional military patrols from nearby nations. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would stand out to the experienced operators inside the ship's combat information center. A radar technician monitoring long-range aerial contacts noticed 4 fast-moving signals appear near the edge of the carrier group's surveillance envelope. At first, the contacts seemed ordinary. The aircraft were flying along a corridor often used by regional military patrols. Their altitude, around 24,000 feet, was typical for routine training or reconnaissance flights. For several minutes, the tracks remained steady and predictable. Then, without warning, all 4 aircraft altered their course. Instead of continuing along their original heading, the formation executed a coordinated turn of nearly 40 degrees. Within seconds, their new trajectory placed them on a path that pointed directly toward the USS Abraham Lincoln and the powerful fleet surrounding it. Inside the Combat Information Center, the shift was immediately noticed. Radar operators zoomed in on the contacts. Tracking systems began calculating speed and heading changes in real time. The aircraft were moving fast, close to 900 kilometers per hour, and maintaining a tight formation. The operator responsible for aerial identification initiated a deeper analysis, comparing radar signatures with known aircraft databases. The Soviet-designed fighter jet, still flown by several air forces around the world, is known for its speed, agility, and combat capability. Iran operates a small but capable fleet of these aircraft, many of which were originally acquired in the early 1990s. Though not as technologically advanced as the latest Western fighters, the MiG-29 remains a formidable aircraft in the hands of experienced pilots. What made this situation unusual was not simply the presence of the jets. It was their sudden decision to redirect toward the carrier strike group. The USS Abraham Lincoln was not alone in those waters. Surrounding the carrier were multiple escort ships, guided missile destroyers, and cruisers equipped with advanced radar arrays capable of tracking aircraft hundreds of miles away. Together, they formed a layered defense system designed to detect and respond to potential threats long before they came within striking distance. Within moments of the course change, additional sensors from the escort ships confirmed the radar tracks. The formation of 4 MiG-29s was now clearly visible across the strike group's networked monitoring systems. The aircraft showed no signs of broadcasting a standard international identification signal, something that military aircraft sometimes omit during training exercises, but usually activate when approaching heavily monitored regions. What concerned the operators even more was the precision of the maneuver. The 4 jets had not turned randomly. According to preliminary calculations generated by the carrier's tracking software, their new course would bring them within roughly 120 kilometers of the strike group if they continued without adjustment. That distance was still far beyond visual range. But in military aviation, closing speeds at high altitude mean that gap can disappear quickly. At the same time, radio monitoring stations aboard the carrier attempted to detect any communication from the approaching aircraft. Sometimes pilots identify themselves on international emergency frequencies when operating near foreign military forces. On this morning, however, the airwaves remained silent. Inside the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere shifted from routine monitoring to focused attention. Officers began reviewing possible explanations. It could be a training flight that had strayed too close to international waters. It could be a deliberate show of presence, or it could be something else entirely. Outside on the open ocean, the carrier strike group continued its steady course, unaware to the naked eye that far beyond the horizon, 4 Iranian MiG-29s were flying on a trajectory that had just captured the full attention of one of the most advanced naval forces in the world. To understand why the sudden approach of 4 Iranian MiG-29 fighters immediately raised alarms aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln, it is important to understand the broader situation in the region at the time. The waters of the Arabian Sea and the nearby Persian Gulf have long been one of the most strategically sensitive areas in the world. Every day, enormous volumes of global energy supplies pass through nearby shipping lanes, particularly through the narrow Strait of Hormuz. Nearly a fifth of the world's oil shipments travel through this corridor, making the region not only economically vital, but also militarily tense. For decades, the United States Navy has maintained a powerful presence in these waters. Carrier strike groups regularly patrol the region to ensure freedom of navigation, protect commercial shipping, and maintain rapid response capability should a crisis erupt anywhere in the Middle East. The USS Abraham Lincoln, one of the U.S. Navy's Nimitz-class aircraft carriers, had entered the area as part of a routine deployment intended to support ongoing operations and reinforce stability in a region where tensions can escalate quickly. At the same time, relations between the United States and Iran have remained complicated and often confrontational. Iran controls the northern coastline of the Persian Gulf and views the presence of large American naval forces close to its shores as a constant reminder of geopolitical rivalry. Over the years, encounters between Iranian military units and U.S. naval forces have occurred with surprising frequency. Fast patrol boats from Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy have sometimes approached American ships at high speed, conducting what U.S. officials describe as unsafe and unprofessional maneuvers. Fighter jets and surveillance aircraft have also occasionally appeared near U.S. vessels operating in international waters. In the months leading up to the incident involving the 4 MiG-29s, the atmosphere in the region had been particularly tense. Intelligence analysts had noted an increase in Iranian aerial patrol activity along sections of the country's southern coastline. According to several defense reports, Iranian Air Force units had conducted a series of large-scale readiness exercises designed to test response times and coordination between radar stations and fighter squadrons. While such drills are not unusual for any military, the scale of these operations had drawn attention among U.S. defense planners monitoring the region. The Iranian Air Force's MiG-29 fleet, though relatively small compared to modern Western air forces, remains one of the country's most capable fighter assets. Originally acquired in the early 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and supplemented by aircraft that fled Iraq during the Gulf War, these jets have undergone periodic upgrades to extend their operational life. Iranian pilots have spent years training with them, often focusing on high-speed interception missions and defensive patrols along the country's southern airspace. At the same time, the USS Abraham Lincoln Strike Group represented an extraordinary concentration of military capability. A single American aircraft carrier carries an entire air wing of advanced fighter jets, electronic warfare aircraft, surveillance planes, and helicopters. The carrier itself is protected by escort ships equipped with the Aegis combat system, powerful radar networks, and dozens of surface-to-air missiles designed to intercept hostile aircraft or incoming threats long before they can reach the fleet. In practical terms, a carrier strike group functions as a floating airbase and command center, capable of projecting power hundreds of miles in every direction. Because of this, any unidentified aircraft approaching such a formation is taken seriously. Even routine patrols from nearby nations are carefully tracked and analyzed. In most cases, pilots flying near American naval forces make their intentions clear by communicating over international radio channels or maintaining predictable flight paths. When aircraft suddenly change course without explanation, military planners must consider every possible scenario, from simple navigational adjustments to deliberate attempts at close-range observation. In the days before the encounter, several commercial ships had also reported brief radar interference while passing through parts of the Arabian Sea, though no official link was ever confirmed. Some analysts later speculated that regional militaries might have been conducting electronic warfare testing in the area, quietly probing the capabilities of surveillance systems operating near international shipping lanes. Whether coincidence or calculated timing, the sudden appearance of 4 Iranian MiG-29 fighters on a direct approach path toward one of the most powerful naval formations in the world occurred against this already complicated backdrop. In a region where military aircraft, warships, and strategic interests constantly intersect, even a small change in direction on a radar screen can quickly transform a routine patrol into a moment of intense attention. Once the 4 MiG-29 fighters were confirmed on radar and their altered course verified across the strike group's sensor network, the situation aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln shifted immediately from observation to response. Modern carrier strike groups are built around the principle of layered awareness, meaning that every contact in the surrounding airspace is continuously tracked, analyzed, and categorized according to potential risk. When the incoming aircraft continued to hold their new trajectory, the system automatically elevated their status from routine contact to unknown approaching formation. Inside the ship's Combat Information Center, officers began coordinating with the strike group's other vessels. The guided missile cruiser operating several miles from the carrier activated additional tracking channels on its Spy-1 radar array, providing a second stream of high-resolution tracking data. At the same time, an airborne early warning aircraft already on patrol, an E-2 Hawkeye, was directed to adjust its surveillance pattern to gain a clearer look at the approaching formation. The Hawkeye's powerful rotating radar dome, capable of detecting aircraft far beyond the horizon, quickly confirmed the four fighters' altitude and spacing. They were flying in a disciplined formation, separated by just a few hundred meters, maintaining speed while gradually descending to a lower altitude profile that would eventually bring them closer to the strike group's operating level. While this was happening, the carrier's command team began evaluating the aircraft's possible intentions. Fighters approaching naval forces in international waters are not automatically considered hostile, but certain patterns raise concern. The steady alignment of the four MiGs suggested a deliberate maneuver rather than random patrol navigation. What drew particular attention was the formation's consistency. For nearly 8 minutes, the aircraft held their spacing with remarkable precision, suggesting experienced pilots flying with clear instructions. On the flight deck above, preparations were already underway. Aircraft carriers operate under a system of readiness conditions, meaning several fighters are always kept on alert status, fully fueled and armed, ready to launch at a moment's notice. This is known as the quick reaction alert posture. On that morning, 2 FA-18E Super Hornets from Strike Fighter Squadron 81 had been assigned to that role. Their pilots had been resting in the ready room just below the deck, wearing flight suits and helmets within arm's reach. When the call came from the carrier's Air Operations Center, the response took less than 3 minutes. The pilots sprinted to the deck as crew members removed safety locks from the aircraft. Jet engines roared to life, the deep mechanical thunder echoing across the steel surface of the carrier. Ground crews performed final checks while the aircraft were guided into position on the catapult launch system. Each Super Hornet carried a standard air defense loadout, advanced radar-guided AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles, and shorter-range AIM-9X Sidewinders, weapons designed specifically for intercepting hostile aircraft if necessary. From the cockpit, the pilots received continuous updates through their encrypted communications channel. The approaching MiG-29 formation had now closed a significant portion of the distance between themselves and the strike group. At their current speed, analysts estimated the fighters could reach visual range of the fleet in less than 20 minutes. The catapult officer gave the signal. One by one, the Super Hornets were hurled down the flight deck and into the sky, accelerating from 0 to nearly 250 kilometers per hour in just a few seconds before climbing sharply above the carrier. Once airborne, the pilots quickly turned toward the approaching contacts, guided by data provided from the E-2 Hawkeye and the carrier's command center. As the American fighters accelerated, their onboard radar systems began searching the airspace ahead. Within moments, the 4 incoming aircraft appeared on their displays. The MiG-29, despite being an older design compared to modern Western fighters, remains a highly maneuverable aircraft capable of impressive speed and sharp turns. The pilots knew they were dealing with capable machines and likely capable aviators flying them. Standard intercept procedures began immediately. The American pilots transmitted a series of identification requests over international military frequencies, following protocols used worldwide when unknown aircraft approach naval forces. The message was simple and professional, requesting the approaching formation to identify themselves and state their intentions. There was no response. The distance continued to shrink. At around 70 kilometers separation, the American fighters adjusted their formation to prepare for visual identification. One aircraft climbed slightly higher while the other moved lower, a tactic designed to provide multiple observation angles while maintaining a defensive posture. Meanwhile, the strike group's escort ships monitored the situation closely, their defensive systems quietly tracking every movement in the sky. For several minutes, the two formations continued closing the gap, each traveling at hundreds of kilometers per hour through the thin morning air. Eventually, the American pilots caught their first glimpse of the distant shapes ahead. 4 small silhouettes glinting under the rising sun. As the distance dropped below 30 kilometers, the situation entered what military planners often describe as the decision zone. At that range, aircraft can visually identify one another, but they are also close enough that any aggressive maneuver could escalate the encounter within seconds. The Super Hornet pilots reduced speed slightly, allowing the MiGs to approach while maintaining control of the intercept geometry. Through their helmet-mounted displays and targeting systems, the shapes of the aircraft became clearer. Twin vertical stabilizers, broad wings, and the distinctive profile of the MiG-29 were unmistakable. The Iranian fighters held their formation for a few more tense moments. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of continuing directly toward the strike group, the lead MiG suddenly banked left, followed almost instantly by the other three aircraft. The maneuver was sharp but controlled, a coordinated turn that redirected the entire formation away from the carrier's position. For several seconds, the American pilots continued flying parallel to them, maintaining visual contact while awaiting further instructions from the carrier. The MiGs did not accelerate aggressively, nor did they attempt to approach again. They simply continued their new course, gradually increasing the distance between themselves and the strike group. Inside the cockpits of the American fighters, the tension eased slightly, but the pilots remained alert. Encounters like this can shift rapidly, and until the aircraft were well outside the fleet's operating zone, the intercept mission was not considered complete. Behind them, far beyond the horizon, the massive USS Abraham Lincoln continued moving steadily through the open sea, its radar systems still watching the skies. As the distance between the two groups of aircraft steadily increased, the immediate tension in the sky began to fade, but the situation was far from over. In military encounters like this, the most important phase often comes after the aircraft separate. Every movement, every radio signal, and every radar trace is carefully reviewed to understand exactly what happened and why. For the strike group surrounding the USS Abraham Lincoln, the next several hours were dedicated to analyzing the encounter in detail. The two American Super Hornets maintained a shadow position behind the departing MiG-29 formation for several minutes, ensuring the fighters were truly leaving the area rather than attempting another approach from a different angle. Eventually, the Iranian jets crossed beyond a pre-established monitoring boundary used by the carrier's tactical command team. At that point, the intercept aircraft received instructions to break off and return to the fleet. The fighters climbed slightly, circled once over the open ocean, and then began the short flight back toward the carrier, where the flight deck crew was already preparing for their recovery. Meanwhile, aboard the strike group's command ship, intelligence specialists began reconstructing the event using data collected from multiple sensors. Modern naval forces record enormous amounts of information during any aerial encounter. Radar tracks, radio transmissions, infrared signatures, and even satellite monitoring feeds can all be combined to create a detailed timeline of what occurred. According to preliminary analysis, the four MiG-29s had approached closer than many routine patrol aircraft typically would, though still within international airspace and without committing any clear act of aggression. Even so, the precision of their maneuver raised questions. Analysts noticed that the formation's course change earlier in the morning had occurred at a point that suggested careful planning rather than random navigation. Some officers believed the maneuver may have been intended as a deliberate probe of the strike group's reaction time, essentially a test to see how quickly American fighters would launch and how they would position themselves during an intercept. Such probing encounters are not unheard of in regions where rival militaries operate within relatively close proximity. Later that day, reports of the encounter began circulating through defense communication channels. While neither side immediately released detailed public statements, sources familiar with naval operations indicated that the situation had been handled according to standard international procedures. No weapons were activated, no warning shots were fired, and no aircraft crossed into restricted defensive zones around the carrier. Privately, however, the incident drew attention among military planners. Encounters between advanced fighters traveling at high speed leave very little room for miscalculation. A sudden turn, a misunderstood radio call, or a pilot interpreting another aircraft's maneuver as hostile could quickly escalate an otherwise controlled situation. Events like this serve as reminders of how delicate military interactions can become in crowded strategic regions. By late afternoon, the USS Abraham Lincoln and its escort ships had resumed normal operations, continuing their patrol through the open waters of the Arabian Sea. The pilots who had launched earlier that morning returned to routine flight rotations, their intercept now just another entry in the carrier's operational log. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, the 4 MiG-29 fighters had already disappeared back into distant airspace. Whether their approach had been a calculated test, a training exercise, or simply a demonstration of presence remains uncertain. What is clear is that for a brief window of time that morning, 2 military forces representing rival powers met silently in the sky above international waters, each watching the other, each prepared, and each aware that even a small moment of misjudgment could have turned a tense encounter into something far more serious.